we're going to be talking about the Massachusetts Act of 1642. So the Massachusetts Act of 1642 was the very first compulsory education law requiring all colonial children to be educated in America. Its establishment led to the widespread literacy improvements across the American colonies and to the foundation of current compulsory education laws in the United States. Although it is no longer in effect today, it demonstrates that Massachusetts and primitive America saw the importance of education early on and recognized that proper education improves a person's life. And it all started with the Puritans. The Puritans came to the Americas in 1630 and founded Plymouth, Massachusetts. They believed that earthly and heavenly quality of life was largely dependent on one's understanding and ability to read the Bible. The early colonies needed literate citizens in order to thrive, as it was actively forming trade deals and a local government and legislature from scratch. They were very quick to emphasize the importance of education and literacy of individuals. They truly thought the well-being of individuals and the success of their colony largely depended on people who were literate enough to read the Bible and the laws of the land. They believed the goal of education and the reason someone must learn to read and write was so they can read the Bible and become spiritually literate, which is why teaching children was so extremely important. So let's take a look at what education is like at the colonies. The Boston Latin School was founded in 1635 and was the first real school founded in America. It did not require tuition, it was for boys only. It was created by the Boston Town Meeting rather than a big church, which is a stark contrast to the majority of its peer schools in England. In 1636, the city of Charleston, Massachusetts started a public school and used the rent from one of its islands to pay the upkeep for it. This practice became common in many other towns across Massachusetts, like towns like Salem or Dorchester. During this period, all children in the colonies were expected to be able to learn to read and write, and most were taught at home by their parents. Some parents were only able to teach their children basic occupational skills and less than adequate literacy skills. Dame schools were taught by single women called dames, often widows or old spinsters. These somewhat literate women taught the students reading, writing, and usually some basic homemaking skills in their homes and were paid by their students' parents. Typically, established schools or grammar schools are exclusive to rich male students, so female or poor students were largely taught at home or in dame schools. Apprentices were very popular at the time for boys. A boy could become an apprentice to a tradesman as early as 10 years old. They'd be taught a specific trade and the skills pertaining to it. And some, but not all, trades necessitated skills like reading and writing. Alright, so here's where the Massachusetts Act of 1642 comes into play. So Massachusetts legislature passed the Act of 1642 declaring all heads of household were to be held responsible for the education of their dependents, which included their children, servants, and apprentices. They were supposed to teach them themselves or hire someone who could. This law was routinely ignored by many families for many years. So, 5 years later, the Massachusetts Act of 1647, or the Old Deluder-Satan Act, was passed in Massachusetts. It was called this because the Puritans believed that if you can read the Bible, you can delude Satan and thwart him from corrupting you. This law required at each town of 50 or more households to have a public school, and towns with 100 or more households were to build a grammar school in addition to the public school. The school and the school teacher were to be provided for and maintained by funds or resources from the townspeople. Families provided for the school by doing any combination of paying part of their child's tuition, providing firewood for their schoolhouse, or boarding the schoolmaster in some capacity. Families contributed, varied by town, as did the admission of girls in public schools. So they commonly taught the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Boys who did not have to work for their family farms usually became apprentices or went to a grammar school or some type of secondary school. Act of 1642, nor the Old Deluder-Satan Act specified that children were required to go to school to receive an education. So many poor children and girls were still educated in dame schools or at home. Even so, there continued to be families who failed to educate their children, even in towns that had good public schools and families who had money to send their children to school. The most common reason why children were not sent to school in this period was because the area was so centered on agriculture. Even with the mandate, once children of farmers were old enough to do significant work on the farm, they were only able to come to school in the winter months. How does all of this affect us now? So how has the Massachusetts Act of 1642 impacted America? Even though in its original state it was not very effective, Massachusetts Act of 1642 was the start of widespread compulsory education in Massachusetts, which spread to the colonies, then to America as a whole. It formed the precedent for how education functions in America today, and it symbolizes America's desire to educate and promote the well-being of its citizens by educating them so they can get better jobs and have higher quality lives. Even back then, they knew that more educated people got better jobs and went further in life, and they understood that education was the right of every American. The original Act of 1642 was not specific about the type or style of education required and gives parents the right to choose on how their children are educated. This act was put in place with the mindset that parents are responsible for the education of their children, which is something many Americans still agree with today. Eventually, the Massachusetts Act of 1642 would inspire the state of Massachusetts to create the first compulsory education law in the United States in 1852. This law functioned essentially the same way as the Act of 1642 and enforced the same things. Unlike the small towns that followed Massachusetts in making public schools, states across America began creating their own compulsory education laws in response to Massachusetts. These education laws are still in place today and form our current education system. So here is a nice little timeline of all the major events. This is the end. Thank you so much for watching.